Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Honestly, Let's Talk. I'm your host, Todd Nesloni, and each week I look to bring you some of my favorite people from across the world to talk about a variety of topics. We've talked about entrepreneurs, authors, Christianity, racism from different perspectives, all kinds of things. And tonight's conversation is all about racism from an Asian perspective. I am so thrilled to have my 5 guests. If you're watching live, yes, I can count. There are 5 people here. The other camera is about to turn on in just a minute. We were just talking before the show started, but I am thrilled today to have just an open and honest conversation with 5 people who I just greatly respect and admire, and I'm thrilled to introduce them to you today. As always, when we have these conversations, I always preface the top of this conversation to say, though we are talking about racism from an Asian perspective today, my 5 guests will agree that they do not speak for all Asian people. The stories and conversations we will have today will be very personal to them and their experiences, and I appreciate them coming on and being vulnerable today for this conversation. So without further ado, this isn't about me. This is about my 5 amazing people. And first up is Alice. Alice, tell everybody who you are.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me on, Todd. And I am a principal in Los Angeles at Richmond Street Elementary School. And I'm glad to be here. I'm going to pass it over to Jeanette.
Hello, my name is Jeanette, and I'm an associate professor of New Testament at Fuller Seminary, and that's in Pasadena, California. And I also taught at Azusa Pacific University 5 years prior to this. And way before that, I was a high school teacher at Compton High in the Los Angeles area.
Quite some variety there, Jeanette. I love it. Nancy, what about you?
My name is Nancy Chung. I am an elementary school teacher in Irvine, California. That's Southern California. And this is my 24th year of teaching. And I teach in a city where we have 41% Asian population.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize that. That's great. And Don?
Hey, everyone. Hey, Todd. So my name's Don Vu, and shout out to, I see Debbie Neighbors, one of my former colleagues, and Julie Bloss there. I live in California, Northern California. My family and I immigrated here as refugees in 1975, right before the fall of Saigon from Vietnam. And I've been in education 24 years, teacher, principal, mainly Title I schools, large populations of immigrants and refugees. And last year, I took a break from my job as principal, and this was before the pandemic happened, and I haven't been back. I'm working on a book, and in fact, the book should be coming out in spring 2021, and it's about the work at the intersection of the immigrant and refugee experience and building a culture of reading in schools. Soon to be out, hopefully, in a few months through Scholastic.
And I am so stinking excited about that book, Don. I cannot even tell you. So bravo. And I know it's going to be such a cool thing when that comes out. And, speaking of books, when I thought about who to invite for this conversation, there was somebody that I've seen some things in her stories and things recently that I really wanted her perspective. And I never in a million years thought she would say yes, because I know she's like, to me, this really famous rock star, New York Times bestseller, all these big things. And I adore her books, but that's author Kelly Yang. Kelly, thank you for being here. Tell everybody who you are besides what I already said.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm Kelly Yang. I'm an author. I'm the author of Front Desk, which is this book right here about a young Chinese immigrant girl who works the front desk of a motel while her parents clean the rooms. It's very much based on my own childhood growing up as an immigrant girl in California. And I'm also the author of 3 Keys, which is the sequel to Front Desk, as well as Parachutes, which is about new immigrants coming over from China, parachuting in without their parents and attending high school. So I'm very familiar both as an artist, as a creator, in terms of, microaggressions, racism, topics like that a lot of kids have to deal with. But also personally, having experienced a lot of what I call corona racism. That's been definitely an issue and devastating. So I'm just excited to be here and talk to you guys.
Awesome. I'm going to jump right into this. You know, just like any other community, your community, the Asian community, is very broad and wide ranging. And so I'd love, before we get started, to see, you know, how do you associate, how do you fall into the Asian community? Where do you associate yourself in there? Alice?
That's a great question. Actually, I thought about that. So I guess being Korean American, I grew up in Torrance, and so there's already a lot of diversity in where I live. But specifically right now, I think through my church, that's one of the main ways that I connect with the Asian community currently.
Jeanette?
I guess.
You know, I grew up in Michigan, so I was the only other Asian American in my school is my brother.
Wow.
Wow.
And but it was when I moved to California where there was more critical mass.
Mhm.
And that was there that I became much more aware of how much I was holding my breath as a little kid. How just like that pressure of trying to assimilate, trying to embrace your culture, trying to deal with these microaggressions that you don't know what to call them until you actually get a vocabulary and can kind of step away from it. And so that's my story. And the church has always been, the Korean American and Asian American church has always been a place where I could feel like I could be myself.
Right.
All throughout my life.
Well, you know, Dawn, you shared a little bit already in your intro, but do you have anything to add?
Well, I grew up in kind of like Jeanette. I grew up in a pretty homogenous small town in the Central Valley, California. And my perspective changed a little bit, well, a lot actually, in college, going to Berkeley, which is definitely more diverse than the experiences I had growing up.
Mm-hmm. What about you, Kelly?
So I went to several schools when I was a kid because we were always moving around. And one of the schools I went to was pretty much all white, like Jeanette was saying. And I really struggled. I really wanted to almost erase like who I was because I wanted so badly to fit in. And I don't know if you remember, there's a scene in Front Desk where she like drapes a banana peel over her head because she wanted to see what it's like to be blonde. But that's like literally taken from my childhood. And it was so hard. It was so hard because people would casually throw statements around. And so you think you fit in, but then bam, there's like a statement where it's clear you're different. It's clear they don't think of you as the same. So that was really, really hard. And then I also went to Berkeley. So big shout out to Berkeley. I love Berkeley. Berkeley was a great experience for me because I got to take lots of like race, classes, race relations and, Asian American studies, like stuff like that. And just became more proud of my, or just more knowledgeable and understood the repercussions of, not speaking up if something happens to you. Like you actually carry a great weight with you. You think that you've brushed it under the rug, but you haven't. You've just delayed it for later. It's going to come back to bite you much harder. And then what happened was I went to law school, and then I actually went to Hong Kong for 15 years because I thought I wanted to get away from law school and like traumatizing experiences in law school. I wanted to get away from the law. I wanted to teach kids. So I was a teacher in Hong Kong for 15 years, and it made me get back in touch with my roots. But I was also viewed as an outsider there because I was an American, and so then coming back as a new immigrant this time around, I recently moved back to the Bay Area. But during like COVID, which is just heartbreaking time to move, to be out and about as an Asian American, you're just getting hostility thrown at you from all directions. Yeah. But so it's been very interesting and kind of mind-blowing, I guess.
Yeah. What about you, Nancy?
My family and I immigrated to the US when I was 10, and I didn't speak any English. And the area that I lived in, kind of like what Jeanette said, I was the only Asian besides my younger brother. So we got a lot of, these, and the kids would, tell me to go back to China, and I would tell them, I'm not even Chinese. And they're like, well, go back to where you came from. So I went from that background to, as I mentioned, living in a community where 41% of our demographics is Asian. And so as a teacher, I have led small workshops with teachers and school staff to teach them a little bit more about the cultural differences of their Korean American students and families. And I have also had small workshops for parents to kind of teach them about the American school system, how different they are than the Korean schools. Like, you can't bring a teacher an envelope full of cash, which we have parents coming and still doing that. And, you know, I would have to tell them, this will be misunderstood. You cannot do this. And my husband jokingly will tell me, tell them after they leave your class, take the envelope now. You can't do that. So I have to kind of tell them about how they can support their students and their teachers to be successful in school without bringing their traditional, like the Korean or the Asian, ways of attending school or being parents.
That's so interesting. And, that's why I love learning about other cultures, because there's so many little idiosyncrasies that happen that you didn't even realize until you educate yourselves over those cultures. And, as we've had these conversations about racism from different cultural perspectives, it is so interesting to me. We talk about our country right now in the United States is having such a reckoning on race, and it's been brought to the forefront in having those conversations that sometimes we can think we've dove into race, but we only looked at it from one perspective, from one cultural identity or cultural group. And that's why I think these conversations are important, because, one reason I really want to have this one today, and I want to talk with y'all about just your own experiences with racism. And Kelly, I want to start with you, because one of the real big reasons I wanted you to be on this conversation today, besides just how much I respect you, is I remember seeing on social media, and I want to say it was back in April or May, when the coronavirus had really started to gain worldwide attention. It was on everybody's conversation. And a lot of the conversation kept stemming back to, it's from China, it's the China virus, all these other things. And uneducated people are very quickly to group everybody that's Asian and that they're all Chinese, or they're all Japanese, or they're all what? Just like the same with Latinx. They all want to say they're all Mexican, or they're all Venezuelan, or they're all whatever. And so I remember you sharing that you had done, I believe it was an Instagram Live, and just some of the comments that people were making. And I remember you sharing a couple of those, and it just broke my heart, as an educator first, to know that your entire career is pouring into kids and helping them feel seen and see others, and telling your story and having so much of you personally in your stories. But then as a human being, to know that people had no shame in a very public setting to say whatever they wanted to say to you. So can you talk a little bit about that, or any other experiences you've had, kind of how you work through it?
And it's hard. So yeah, definitely as soon as COVID started happening and schools closed, I immediately thought, well, like, there goes, my chance to meet readers, and I had everything was canceled. So I thought, what, I'm going to do a class, and it's going to be free for kids, for anybody really, teenagers, adults, to learn writing. I think it was like the second or third class. I just noticed that there were these comments, on Instagram as you're doing the class. They just popped up, and they said like Chinese virus, and like, yes, you're Chinese virus, or something like that. But it happened several times in the class. And first of all, my first reaction was just, I have to carry on with the class. I can't let this hijack my class. I just have to get through the class. I mean, and maybe that was just an instinct from being a teacher all these years, but I just froze and like almost mentally blocked out the comments. I just didn't look down at the, this comments part. But I tried my best to get through the class. And I did get through the class, but as soon as I finished the class, I started seeing my Twitter. A lot of people were in the class, and they were talking about what happened. It wasn't something that I could ignore, and it wasn't something that everyone else could ignore either. And that's when I realized I had to say something about it. And I basically said, look, this has happened to me. I had a screenshot, or somebody sent me a screenshot, and I just posted it. And I said, if this is happening to me, this is happening to so many other people. And something about like screens, people getting behind a screen, they feel anonymous, and like they just feel like they can say whatever they want. And sometimes that stuff that they don't realize is like, I'm a real person on the other side of the screen, you know? And here I am like trying to open myself up, and it's already, first of all, it's already like terrifying enough to do a virtual event, you know, to a bunch of strangers. It's really hard. But to then have like in real time these comments blast at you is just, it's so hard. And I remember sitting with this, I was like in tears. My agent called me, my editor called me. Everybody was like, you know, you don't have to do this. You can stop. You know, you don't have to do this. Like, no one is asking you to do this. You can stop. But I didn't want to stop. I took a day. I mean, it knocked me off balance for a whole day. And then I decided that I was going to carry on with the class, but I had a long conversation with my class, and it basically said, look, this is not okay. Like, you know, if you're going to keep doing this, then there will be no class, and we'll all suffer as a result. I won't be able to connect with you. You won't be able to get this amazing free class. So I basically just left it to the people in that live, like, if you wanted to keep going with it, but you can't like abuse me, right? So, but it was really, really tough. And then I found out later that it was actually a teenager, which made me feel a lot better, because I think teenagers, you know, I'm not saying they get a free pass, but they're still learning, they're still growing, and it's part of our job to educate them and make sure that they understand, number one, they have to be accountable for their words, but also that, you know, there is a learning opportunity here. There's a learning moment. So that kid actually reached out and apologized after his teacher alerted him. Yeah, that everybody was talking about this online. I feel bad for the poor kid, but it was pretty terrifying for me too.
I remember it happening, and it just, I know for me, I would have just been in tears. Like, I wouldn't have been able to go on. And I know that, you know, having the profile you do as well, and being all over the place. I mean, you've probably experienced that many times in your life, and that's what hurts me the most, is knowing that probably wasn't. There's no probably. That definitely wasn't the first time that you've experienced that. You know, you bring a lot of your personal self into your books as well, correct?
Yeah, definitely, and it's always, you know, it's always terrifying to open yourself up, whether it's on the page or in real person, in real life. But, you know, I thought this one was really hard, because I somehow convinced myself that, you know, if you've, you know, achieved a certain level of like respect generally, and you've worked hard, that people aren't going to just blast you with all this stuff constantly. But it's just complete BS, basically, because what happens is, no matter who you are, no matter what you've achieved, you can get blasted with this stuff. And that's what's so dehumanizing about this experience. And that's why, you know, we really need to care when people go through this, like whether it's Asian people or Black people, like we really all need to care. This is not okay. It dehumanizes us, makes us feel horrible. And I mean, it knocked me off for a whole day, but it could have easily knocked me off for like a whole year even.
Yeah. And, you know, Jeanette, you're in ministry now, and so you have a whole nother platform. People are looking at you and working with you, and you've been in education as well too. What's an experience you've had?
Well, you know, one thing, the rhetoric of Kung flu or China virus or foreign virus, it's so otherizing, right? The language itself is saying we are not American. Right. So it's, again, another example of the perpetual foreigner stereotype rearing its ugly head. We saw this in the LA riots. We see this again and again in U.S. history. When anything Asia kind of seems to be a threat, we are no longer American. We are foreign. And so that's not new, but it's just people have become conscientized to the fact that this is like undeniably happening. The numbers are increasing, like Stop AAPI Hate. And Stop AAPI Hate Youth. Those are Russell Jung from San Francisco State University helped start those. They're like tracking this data because it's the kind of data you can't easily document. And it makes you think you're crazy. Are these things really happening? But youth are experiencing greater incidents of racism, of profiling, etc. Right. So I think the murder of George Floyd coupled with all of this anti-Asian racism, has really required AAPI Christians, Asian American Pacific Islander Christians, to not be able to say nothing, to not be able to say you be a good minority, you be a good Christian, and all of this will just not bother you. But no, it isn't true. And so I found that it's important at the pulpit, it's important in the church, it's important in these spaces, especially to talk about it in light of like who God is, and we're made in the image of God. Our Black sisters and brothers are made in the image of God. And so when we are actually speaking up for Black lives, we are not just speaking as like, oh, we're so generous, we're so loving. No, we're speaking for our own liberation. That their humanity and their rights are tied in with ours. We can't just separate ourselves. So I think that's something like that. I see an increase in churches, even where before they're more politically reticent to speak up, are seeing that to love our neighbor as ourselves requires that we love our neighbor. Right. And also acknowledge that racism is happening to us, to not be invisible.
And it's so, you said something there that really, there were several things that really resonated with me, but, just hearing you talk too, it's so reflective to me of how much those of us who are white, and speaking for myself as middle-class, male, white American, how much is taken for advantage being in the United States. Because if you're part of the Latinx community, you're otherized because you're an immigrant or you're coming over the wall or any of this stuff. If you're in the Asian American community, you're otherized because of the coronavirus and all the rhetoric that comes down from that. If you're in the Black community, you're otherized because of all the police brutality and the unarmed killings and all these. I mean, there's so many things that are happening. Nancy, what's an experience you've had with dealing with racism?
I think a lot of it is the microaggression. It's the everyday comments like, teachers or even like people in education calling our group of Asian population at our school as the crazy rich Asians, things like that. And they think it's really funny, because the movie just came out. And so they'll refer to some of our parents and students as that. And I, have to remind them all the time, it's not funny. It's not appropriate. It's not okay. Or, they'll say like, oh, well, all of the weird names, I can't pronounce or memorize all of the weird names. Why can't they just come up with an American name or an English name? Or, so they'll make fun of the names and make fun of the accents and make fun of the way that certain parents handle situations. And they lump all of us together and say, you people, like human beings, or, like, who are you referring to? But we get lumped together as you people. And, I've been asked to come translate for other languages. And I have to remind them, I only speak Korean, English, and some Spanish. What language do you want me to translate in? Do you speak Chinese? No. Can you try? Like, okay. I can try really hard, but I have a feeling I can't, So those things like that, people who are not of color, I don't think they recognize that those are racism. That's racism as well. It's not just the blatant, Kung flu, go back to China, that kind of, racism. It's the everyday things like, what are you eating? Oh, that's so disgusting. Like that smells, or, what is that? Oh, you guys eat some funky stuff. Like those little things, comments from adults, not just children, but adults and even educators, that really saddens me.
And I think something really powerful that you shared there was oftentimes it's the little things. It's the things that the people who are saying it are just blowing it off as like it's not a big deal. Mm-hmm. But you're like, to me it is. To me, this is racism. This is not, I don't have to put up with this. I don't have to be treated like that just because you look at me this way and have this bias in your own life. So thank you for sharing that, Nancy. Don, what about you?
So I just wanted to just add something to what Jeanette was saying in terms of the data, tracking the data. I pulled up some of the FBI hate crime stats. Hate crimes against Muslims and Arab Americans were at an all-time high when terrorism was a top concern in America over the past few years. And now, with coronavirus being the top concern today, over 2,100 anti-Asian American hate crimes were reported in the months of March and June, between the months of March and June. That's 3 months, 2,100 anti-Asian American hate crimes that were reported, and they're guessing like half of the hate crimes weren't reported. So it's a huge increase in the number of hate crimes, and it just goes to the fact that the idea that there's always going to be an other, right? An other, somebody, there's always going to be a scapegoating of a people, and so for me, it's kind of like the everyday aggressions, kind of like what Nancy was saying, that it's not directed towards me personally, specifically, but just it's in my face every day, like a Confederate flag flying on a truck, driving through. And even with, I hate to make this political, but sometimes we have to get political, right? Even with Trump saying most recently, a few days ago, that Representative Ilhan Omar, right, saying that she's telling us, and I quote, telling us how to run our country. How is your country doing? And there's no way to interpret this except the fact that this president doesn't see refugees and immigrants as Americans, right? And even if you weren't born here, but a person of color, right? He still questions the citizenship of others. Remember the federal judge, Gonzalo Curiel? He talked about this judge who was born in India, Mexican-American heritage. He claimed that because he was Mexican, quote unquote, he could not rule impartially on the case of the border wall. And so, is this a direct assault on me? I'd say yes, right? Because it impacts me as an immigrant, as a refugee, as an Asian American. And even though the president of the United States didn't say it to me directly, I think the power of his office influences my life in many ways, directly and indirectly. And it's different from somebody on Facebook saying it, or on the street saying it, because they really don't have the power over me, but our elected officials do. And I think that impacts not only me, but just any person of color, right? When you get looked on as the other.
And it, like you said, we try to have these conversations outside of politics, but there's times where, especially with something like this, it's hard to. And, I can't even imagine being a refugee here in this country and hearing some of the things that are said from the people who were elected to protect you, from the people who were elected to represent you and make laws that serve you as an American citizen. And so it's just.
And it goes back to what Kelly was saying about, no matter how accomplished you are, right? He's talking about a judge. He's talking about a congresswoman, right? It doesn't matter how accomplished you are. You're always going to be looked at as an outsider.
Well, and I think one thing to point out too in this conversation is that we're not saying you can't disagree with people. Like everybody in here knows, we all disagree with people all the time, but you don't have to do it from perspective where the race comes in or you're otherizing people. So I think that's important that you said that, Dawn. Alice, what about you? What experience have you had?
I'm kind of more like Nancy. Being in the education field, and also being a principal at a school, I don't think people are going to be blatantly saying things to my face, but there have been experiences where I've been at conferences and it's predominantly Caucasian. There was one in particular that I went last year at a very prestigious university in the East Coast, and there are about 100 administrators there, and out of the 100, there are about 5 people of color, including me and another Asian gal that was there. And I remember just sitting at a table and no one was talking to me. They were all talking with each other, and I'm trying to insert, my opinions and my thoughts on certain topics, and they would dismiss me. And I'm like, oh my God, this is such a weird experience. Like, why won't they listen to me? I have important things to say, and I think things to contribute. And so I don't know, to blatantly say like maybe that was racism, maybe not, but just kind of seeing the makeup of who was at this conference, I couldn't help but feel very othered. Right. And Nancy, like I've had kids actually at my school. I don't have a very large Asian population at the school that I serve, but kids would come sometimes like crying, saying like, oh, Dr. Lee, they're making fun of the spam that I brought, because I love Spam. And I was like, and trying to pump up this kid. I was like, I love Spam. Oh my God, that is so good. Spam Masubi party with me, and so it's things like that. Long time ago, I got into a car accident, and the lady that I got, and granted, I shouldn't have gone into the accident, but she was screaming like, "You Orientals!" And I was like, "I'm not a rug. I'm an Asian person. I'm not Oriental like that." But these things accumulate, right? And there are moments, I think, in our careers and in our life where we don't recognize our well, at least let me speak for myself. I don't recognize the otherness, but I think in this Corona time, it's definitely been more amplified that, oh, I am other, and sometimes I have to be careful where I go, or I consciously think, okay, like if I go to this Target in this community, what do I need to prepare for possibly, right? Kelly, I think there was also a video that really bothered me that you posted up at an encounter at a park, and just things like that. It's like, and it's happened in my hometown where a gentleman was walking his dog in Torrance, and some lady just ran up to him and just started spewing all this racial vitriol to him. He wasn't doing anything, and things like that. You're like, oh my gosh, I'm eating at a restaurant, and someone's coming up to say something completely unsolicited. I wasn't even bothering them. So I think things like that, it's kind of kept me a little bit heightened on my toes. But in terms of like solutions, like what can I do as an administrator? What can I do as an educator? And I go back to empathy, and I go back to literacy and literature, and books like what Kelly has written, Front Desk, 3 Keys. I have other books like Drawn Together. I make sure that our classrooms, and Todd and Dawn, you guys know we're big on this, about really making sure that our young children, it starts from a young age, that they're exposed to a variety of literature and not just one narrative. We need to really expose our children. And it's not an agenda. It's not a political agenda, but we're trying to share with our students that our country is made up of beautiful stories, and it's not a singular narrative. And that's how I feel like we can help combat some of this. And also, speaking of, if you hear something or you see something funky going on, don't let that person go on suffering by themselves. Say something with them, stand up next to them, even if they're a perfect stranger.
I think that's huge. It's making sure that all of us have to do our part in making sure that we stand up for each other in those moments. But I love what you shared about the importance of introducing them to a wide variety of characters through the books they're reading, because that is a great way to build empathy, and that is a great starting point for many kids. And as I know we try to keep these conversations to a typical time limit, but I want to jump into a question here that I just wonder about as I hear you talk. I know some of you in this group are parents. And so my question then would be, what conversations do you find yourself having with your kids that either you may have had with your parents when you were growing up, or you may not have, and you're having new conversations with your children? Because I know when we did the episode over racism from a Black perspective, many of them said, there are very specific conversations as Black Americans that we have to have with our children. Do any of you find yourself having some of those? I'll let anybody who wants to jump in answer that one.
Yeah, I mean, I have 3 kids, and we had to have a pretty serious talk after what Alice was saying was the dog park incident that we got into with this lady, where she just went off on me and said that I needed to go back to where I came from. My kids were genuinely confused because we hadn't had that conversation with them. We thought we might be able to avoid it in like 2020. But obviously we can't avoid it. So my kids were genuinely confused. They were like, what does she mean go back to where we came from? Does she mean like go back to our house like 3 blocks away? And I was like, no, that's not. And there was definitely a tense moment there where I could have just said, oh, don't worry about it, she didn't mean anything, and not had the conversation. But I made a decision. I thought, if I don't have the conversation, then I'm basically just condoning what she said, and I'm making that like normal or something. I need to have the conversation. So I had to have the conversation and told my kids, these are the slurred terms that people use against us. They're not okay. And then, we had to explain kind of why. And there is no explanation of why, other than just some people are just not going to like the way we look. There's really no, I I don't know any sophisticated, explanation for why racism happens. People just sometimes are racist, and I have to explain that to my kids. And then the other thing that I really love about Three Keys, my sequel, is that the kids will learn the 3 keys of friendship, which are the same 3 keys of allyship, which is you got to listen, you got to care, and you got to keep trying. And I always tell my kids this because it applies to all communities. When somebody is suffering from the Latinx community or from the Black community, we have to care. We have to care. We have to listen. We have to keep trying.
I love that.
Well, I have 2 older kids, 2 grown kids. I have a son who's a freshman at Berkeley. He's in school right now, doing everything online. And so as he prepares to leave the Irvine bubble, the Orange County curtain, I have to remind him to not just be proud of, who he is, but embrace or brace for or get ready for all that's out there, all the hatred and all the racism that's out there. And I have to remind him, it's not going to be as safe as Irvine here. You need to be prepared for that. But when these things are done to you or said to you, you also have to be able to forgive them. It doesn't mean just ignore it, but like what Kelly said and as we've been talking about, you have to voice yourself, voice your concerns, voice your, just voice yourself, but also be able to forgive them. Like, don't hate them, and don't hate them, but like hate the crime. I know that sounds so cliche, but you have to try to educate them. And my daughter is a first-year teacher. And so same thing, I have to remind her, you are going to have parents who will just blatantly hate you because you're Asian. So you have to forgive them, you have to educate them, and be prepared for that too.
Yeah, and I want to add, joy is a very good form of activism. We have to remember that, like joy, taking joy in what we do and just carrying on with our lives, like finding that joy. It is so important to keep fighting the fight.
Right. And ask them, what do you take away from this? What did you learn from this? What are you going to do about it? Right.
Yeah.
I'm still in shock that. Oh, I'm sorry.
Please go.
Oh, I'm still in shock that Nancy has a kid in college. She looks like she could be in college.
Post college.
Anyways, I'll just be really quick. So we had to talk to my daughter too about when she goes back to school, like what she could potentially face. Luckily, she watches the news with us, so she's kind of aware. She's 11 years old, so she's in 6th grade. So it's a little bit easier to have that conversation. But we let her know. We say, hey, you might go to school, and some people in your school might say some mean things about you. They might say some things about the virus, and so we told her to make sure that she lets us know, but to speak up for herself. Things that, as a kid, I didn't do. I didn't let my parents know whenever I was called a name, whenever I was bullied because of my race. So you try to make the next generation better. You try to give them a voice and try to let them know that they're supported. But that's it. Jeanette, I'm sorry I interrupted you. Jeanette, you were going to say something?
I think at least being second generation, our parents had different survival strategies. And the kind of put your head down and kind of get through education, like, prove them wrong kind of thing. It doesn't work and it's not enough, but I understand it. And so what I try to do is not wait for my schools to teach Asian American history, but to introduce them to Asian American history. Like Ronald Kakaki's Strangers from a Different Shore has a kid's version. And I had my son read it and we talked about it, or the PBS documentary, Asian Americans. It's a great way to get like junior high kids and high school kids cognizant of the history, how rich and how complex and diverse it is. And also to let them know they're not crazy when they're sensing these microaggressions, to put names to it, to call it out as what it is. Because what I hated, and it took me a lot of work to get over, was like, am I crazy when I'm in a classroom, in a seminar, and I'm the only one raising certain issues and having certain questions? Is my way of reading, is my way of engaging wrong? Or is it different because of who I am? And are they, am I, and just because other people aren't raising these questions or seeing it the way that I am doesn't make me less of a thinker, less of a writer, less of a scholar, but it was a fight.
Well, Jeanette, you said something powerful there too. It reminded me. So I watched an interview today with Kerry Washington, and I love her. And she's a Hollywood actress and all these TV shows and movies and things. But she said, I don't wait for the schools to teach my children about our heritage. She goes, I've been introducing it to them myself. And she said, because sometimes what will happen with curriculum is it focuses on all the painful moments. And she said, and that's important. She goes, but I want my kids to see the joy of where we came from, to see how varied and beautiful and powerful those stories are. And it's not just about the pain. Yes, that's places we've been to, but there's so much beauty in what our culture brings. And when you said that too, that really resonated with me about how, we need to be learning all these beautiful intricacies in every single culture and celebrating them because they're worth celebrating. Alice, what about you with your kids?
I mean, I think they definitely put it in way more articulate ways than I have. What's interesting about my kids' educational journey, at least, is that because I'm an administrator at my district, I don't think they all know who my kids are too. So I don't think they would blatantly go to my kids and make a comment. But I'm taking kind of the road that what Jeanette is doing. So really introducing some of these stories, especially that are written. There's a recent one, gosh, that just came out. It's called Mindy Kim. It's these great books. And, there's not a lot of, Kelly, you're definitely adding to the repertoire of Asian American literature, but there's not a lot out there. And so what I've been doing is trying to find them, and I'll buy them from my daughter. And the first thing she said when she saw this was, oh, I had that dress. Oh, that looks like me. And so, I'm trying, and these books explain parts of the Korean culture that they can resonate with, or the Asian culture that they can resonate with better than me kind of teaching them explicitly, which I think is also very important. But yeah, we took them on a trip to Korea a couple years ago and they loved it. And I'm trying to consciously make sure that we do make these trips often, to not just Korea, but to China, Thailand. I want them to see that the world is bigger than them and bigger than their life here in Los Angeles, and that they have to see a lot. They have to see and experience a lot to be empathetic humans.
Right. Well, I am so grateful that you five shared some time with me today. I know that, this is a conversation that I could listen to you five talk for hours. I have so many other things that I just want to learn from you. But the point of these Honestly Let's Talk conversations, they're just supposed to begin the conversation. So for those listening or watching, my encouragement to you is broaden your circles. Go and read, go and learn, go and have conversations. And if you heard nothing else today, I hope you heard the importance of empathy and standing up when you see something that is wrong. And if you're the one that's in the wrong, apologize, educate yourself, and make it better. Alice, Dawn, Nancy, Kelly, Jeanette, thank you so much for spending some time with me today. For my listeners and viewers today, go online or to your local bookstore and buy Kelly's new book, 3 Keys. I'm so excited about it. But thank you all so much for sharing with me today. Make sure you join next week for a new conversation on Honestly Let's Talk, where we'll be talking about Islam. So make sure you join in that conversation, and you can check out all the past episodes on YouTube, iTunes, or Spotify.